Our planet has been host to two devastating world wars with an estimated combined death toll of over 100 million people. With advancements in military equipment and nuclear power, that death toll would likely be dwarfed by the potentially planet-ending effects of a World War III. There have been many incidents since the end of World War II, such as Norwegian students studying the Aurora Borealis, which have snowballed out of control and put us on the brink of such a war, but it's never happened. You probably don't even realise that you wouldn't be watching this video if it wasn't for Stanislav Petrov. Here are 6 times World War III nearly happened, but didn't. We begin in 1961 at the Berlin Wall. Despite failing to stop its erection, the Allies were not prepared to go to war over it. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, famously said, "A wall is a lot better than a war." Despite this, tension still remained about the pre-agreed access rights to East Berlin and along the road, rail and air routes between West Berlin and West Germany. In October 1961, Washington sent General Clay to the wall after numerous attempts from East German border officials to hinder US diplomats' access. He ordered that the next American diplomat entering East Berlin was to be escorted by the US Army. While the order was successful, border officials continued to hinder diplomatic crossings, breaking the pre-agreement of the wall. Just 6 days later, on the 27th of October, General Clay ordered 10 American M48 tanks to head for Checkpoint Charlie. They parked just 50 meters from the border, noisily racing their engines to make their presence known. The Soviets responded to the threat with 10 T-55 tanks of their own. 16 nail-biting hours passed of 20 metal boxes loaded with devastating ammunition facing off. Any wrong move could have led to the start of a war. General Clay was reminded that the wall was not vital enough to start a conflict with Moscow over. On October the 28th at 11 AM, Kennedy suggested to Khrushchev, the Russian head of government, to remove his tanks, promising that the US would reciprocate. A Soviet tank reversed 5 meters and so did a US tank. This led to the removal of both sides' tanks and the standoff ended peacefully. A close shave and a stark reminder how a few small actions can snowball into potentially starting a war. Probably the most well-known, potentially World War III causing event on this list is the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev saw an opportunity to strengthen his relationship with Cuban leader Fidel Castro after President Kennedy's failed attempt to push him out of power in 1961. This was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Looking at the location of Cuba, you can see why Khrushchev wanted a strong presence here. He began to ship surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles to Cuba to prevent any more US aggression. At this point, President Kennedy did not protest. This was until October the 14th when an American U-2 spy plane captured images of nuclear missile silos being built by the Soviet Union on Cuba. After extensive meetings and deliberations over the best course of action, one option being an immediate invasion of Cuba, Kennedy implemented a naval blockade, a ring of ships around the island. The goal of this quarantine was to prevent more Soviet supplies entering the country. On October the 22nd, JF Kennedy addressed the nation and said this:
"In the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island."
For 6 days, the world stood on the brink of a nuclear war whilst Khrushchev and Kennedy debated through a series of letters. Eventually, it was agreed that the Soviets would dismantle the weapons in exchange for US agreeing not to invade Cuba. It wasn't found out until 25 years later that the US also agreed to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey. Over to the Middle East now. Egypt had recently suffered a humiliating defeat in the 1967 Arab-Israeli Six-Day War and therefore wanted to get revenge. So in 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on the Sinai and Golan Heights, territory lost in the Six-Day War. They did this on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a Jewish holiday day. The streets are often empty, so the attack really caught Israel off guard. At first, Egypt and its allies made significant ground, with Israeli leaders even fearing the end of their nation. Israel managed to turn it around though. They advanced into Syria and had trapped the Egyptian Third Army with its supply lines cut off. During this, there were multiple failed attempts at calling a ceasefire, so guess who got involved? The US and the Soviet Union. The Kremlin sent the White House this message:
"I will say it straight that, if you find it impossible to act jointly with in this matter, we should be faced with the necessity urgently to consider taking appropriate steps unilaterally."
Evidently, this was an attempt by the Soviet Union to move troops into the Middle East and gain a foothold, a move which the US could not allow. The US Army was moved to DEFCON 3. The tension was palpable. Both sides knew that their vessels were being tracked by opposing sides' submarines, but for whatever reason, the Soviets kept their forces on high alert but agreed not to dispatch troops into the region. If Soviet forces had gone into the Middle East and ended up in a war with the Israelis, things would have been very, very different. The US and NATO conducted an annual exercise named Able Archer, Archer. This was done to stimulate a period of conflict escalation, ensuring they were prepared if the real thing was to happen. The exercise in 1983 included new features such as coded communication, radio silences, and even participation from the head of governments. All of this was done to increase the realism. Despite NATO communications being coded, each message started with the word exercise. The US and NATO assumed the Soviets could understand this. However, that was not the case. Soviet forces began reacting to Able Archer as if it was real preparation from NATO to launch a nuclear missile. They readied nuclear forces and placed air units in East Germany and Poland. Once the exercise came to an end, the Soviets slowly backed off, but this was certainly close to an all-out war because of practice. Stanislav Petrov. Without this man, arguably, you wouldn't be watching this video. It was the 26th of September 1983. In the early hours of the morning, the Soviet Union's missile system detected an incoming strike from the US. The protocol for response is simple: send Soviet missiles back. Thankfully for us all, Stanislav Petrov was working that day. His job was to register enemy missile launches. He decided not to report the missile attack to his superiors, dismissing the alert as a false alarm. He decided to wait for corroborating evidence first, of which none arrived, and therefore he reported it as a system malfunction. If he was wrong, nuclear missile explosions would have happened in Russia just minutes later. If he reported it, it would have led to a nuclear apocalypse. Mr. Petrov has since said he was never 100% sure that he was making the right call, and that if anybody else was on shift, they would have reported it straight away. You might be surprised to hear this, but a nuclear apocalypse nearly happened as recent as 1995. A team of Norwegian and American students launched a Black Brant sounding rocket from the Andøya rocket range, just off the northwestern coast of Norway. The launch was purely for science. The rocket carried equipment to study the aurora borealis. The issue was, the rocket's high northbound trajectory and peak altitude of 1,453 kilometers was very similar to that of a US Navy Trident missile. Russian nuclear forces were instantly put on high alert, and the nuclear briefcase was brought to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. It was him who must now decide whether to launch a retaliation nuclear attack or not. Fortunately, Russian observers determined that there was no nuclear threat, so no response was ordered. Evidently, we have come frighteningly close to multiple nuclear wars, a bone-chilling thought.